spirits that manifest in photographs. The photo was still developing when she noticed it, right there, behind her boyfriend's reflection. A face, distorted and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at her. The dark room was silent, except for the faint hiss of chemicals. But then she heard it, a wet, gasping breath coming from the shadows. "Kyle," she whispered, but Kyle wasn't there anymore. Jessica spotted the camera on a drizzly Saturday morning. The flea market sprawled across a neglected parking lot, with vendors sheltering their wares beneath mismatched tarps. Her shoes squelched in the mud as she moved between tables, idly picking through old records, tarnished jewelry, and forgotten antiques. She didn't know what she was looking for, really, just something unique. That's when she saw it. The camera sat in a crooked box labeled "Estate Sale," in faded black marker, surrounded by moth-eaten photo albums and brittle, yellowed snapshots. It was a Polaroid, old, battered, and heavy in her hands. Scratches marred its surface and the lens was smeared with grime. Yet there was something captivating about it. Nostalgia, maybe, or the way the cold metal seemed to pulse faintly against her palms, as if it still held life inside. "How much?" Jessica asked the vendor, a gaunt man with an unsettlingly wide grin. His teeth were crooked and yellow, but his eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite amusement. "For that? $20, he said. "Takes real memories, that one." "Real memories?" Jessica echoed, raising an eyebrow. The man chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. Never mind me. Just old superstitions. You want it or not?" She hesitated, but only for a moment. There was something about the camera, something she couldn't put into words. It felt significant. She handed over a crumpled 20, and the vendor's grin widened impossibly, as if his cheeks might split. "Enjoy," he said, his voice dripping with something that felt more like a warning than a wish. That night, the camera sat on the coffee table, and Jessica couldn't stop glancing at it. She told herself it was just curiosity, that she was itching to see if it still worked. Kyle, her boyfriend, was sprawled on the couch beside her, scrolling through his phone. "Hey," Jessica said, nudging him. "Let's test this thing out." Kyle groaned but sat up, running a hand through his messy hair. "Seriously? That old thing? It probably doesn't even work." "Only one way to find out," she replied, already loading the film. She aimed the camera at him and pressed the button. The flash was startlingly bright, casting harsh shadows on the walls. The room smelled faintly of burnt plastic as the photo slid out with a soft whir. Jessica waved the picture in the air, waiting for the image to develop. She giggled as the outline of Kyle's face appeared, but her laughter died abruptly. Something wasn't right. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary photo of Kyle, his easygoing grin captured perfectly. But as the image sharpened, Jessica's stomach twisted. His grin was wrong, too wide, too sharp, as if his teeth had been replaced with jagged shards of glass. His eyes were sunken, shadowed, and gleaming with something that didn't belong to him. And then there was the shadow. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a dark smudge behind Kyle, shapeless yet somehow unmistakably human. Jessica's pulse quickened. She held up the photo to the light, squinting, hoping it was just a trick of the old camera. "What?" Kyle asked, leaning closer. "Nothing," she lied, slipping the photo into her pocket. "Just looks kinda weird. I think the camera's busted." Kyle shrugged, already losing interest. But Jessica couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. She set the camera aside, resolving to ignore it for the rest of the night, but ignoring it wasn't so easy. As they watched TV, Jessica felt her eyes drawn to the camera again and again. It sat there, inert and ordinary, yet it felt aware, like it was watching her, judging her. The sensation was ridiculous, she told herself, but it wouldn't go away. When Kyle went to bed, Jessica stayed behind. She pulled the photo from her pocket and stared at it under the dim lamp. The shadow behind Kyle was clearer now, as if it had developed further after she'd put it away. It wasn't shapeless anymore. It had arms, long and thin, and something that might have been a face. a pale blur with deep hollows where eyes should have been. Jessica's heart pounded as she shoved the photo into a drawer, slamming it shut. She wouldn't think about it anymore. It was just an old camera, an old, broken camera. But as she turned off the lights and headed to bed, she swore she heard something faint, a soft click, like the sound of a shutter snapping closed. The next morning, she found a new photo sitting on the coffee table. She froze, staring at it, her mind racing. She hadn't touched the camera since last night, and Kyle certainly wouldn't have. But there it was. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was a picture of her. She was sitting on the couch, the lamp casting long shadows across her face. But there was someone else in the photo, standing just behind her. A woman. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was gaunt, her hair stringy and matted, and her eyes were endless pits of darkness. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, stretching wider than humanly possible. Jessica dropped the photo, her pulse roaring in her ears. She spun around, expecting to see the woman there looming over her, but the room was empty, silent. The camera, though, was no longer on the coffee table. It was on the couch, pointing directly at her. Over the following days, Jessica found herself avoiding the camera. She'd shoved it into a drawer in the kitchen, thinking out of sight, out of mind. But it wasn't so simple. The unease lingered, curling in the corners of her mind like smoke. She would catch herself glancing at the drawer as she passed it, her pulse quickening for no reason she could justify. Every time her eyes met that spot, it felt like the air grew heavier, thicker, as if something inside the camera was waiting. But Jessica didn't talk about it, not to Kyle or anyone else. She didn't even tell him about the new photo she'd found. It seemed easier to pretend it hadn't happened, to convince herself it was some kind of elaborate prank her mind was playing. After all, cameras didn't take pictures on their own, and women with hollow eyes didn't crawl out of shadows in photographs. It wasn't possible. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left her. It wasn't just the camera anymore. It was as if the house itself had begun to shift around her. Rooms that had once been warm and familiar now seemed foreign and wrong, as though they had been subtly rearranged by invisible hands. The silence was oppressive, almost tangible. Jessica began to hear faint noises in the walls, scratching, whispering, and the occasional groan of the wooden frame settling, though she'd never heard it before in all the years she'd lived there. It was only when Jessica picked up the camera again that the activity escalated. She hadn't meant to. She'd gone to the kitchen late at night for a glass of water, her bare feet cold against the tiled floor. She hadn't even been thinking about the drawer. But as she reached for a cabinet, her gaze flickered downward, and there it was, her hand on the handle, her knuckles tight and pale. The realization came with a jolt of panic, but it was already too late. She had opened it. The camera sat there, untouched, as though it had been waiting patiently for her to return. Its lens seemed cleaner than she remembered, clearer, almost polished. Jessica stared at it for what felt like an eternity, her breath caught in her throat. And then, against all reason, her hand reached out and lifted it. It felt different this time, heavier, colder, like a block of ice had formed inside it. Her hands trembled as she raised it to her eye, peering through the viewfinder. The kitchen looked dim and distorted through the cracked glass, but there was something else. Something moved in the reflection. Jessica froze. She didn't dare blink, her heart hammering in her chest. There was a figure in the viewfinder standing at the edge of the frame. It was just out of focus, but she could tell it was the same woman from the photograph, the stringy-haired, hollow-eyed thing that had haunted her in the pictures. Only now, it wasn't a photo. It was real. Jessica whipped the camera down, spinning around to face the empty kitchen. Nothing was there. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. But when she looked back into the viewfinder, the figure had moved closer, her face barely inches from the lens. Jessica screamed, dropping the camera with a loud clatter. It hit the floor but didn't break, landing perfectly upright with the lens pointed at her. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the camera whirred, spitting out a new photograph. Jessica's pulse roared in her ears as she bent down to pick it up. The image developed slowly, the colors bleeding into each other in that familiar, sickly way. But this time, there was no mistaking what she saw. The photo showed Jessica herself, standing in the kitchen, wide-eyed and pale. Behind her, the woman loomed, her skeletal arms stretched out as though she was about to drag Jessica into the darkness. Her face was a grotesque mockery of humanity, her jaw unhinged, her teeth jagged and too numerous to fit in her mouth. Jessica backed away from the photo, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it. She didn't even realize she was crying until she tasted salt on her lips. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she told herself to stop being ridiculous. This couldn't be real. Cameras didn't do this. They didn't see things that weren't there. But as she turned to flee the kitchen, she heard it again. The faint click of the shutter. She froze, her body going rigid with terror. Slowly, as though any sudden movement might provoke whatever was in the room with her, Jessica turned around. The camera was sitting there, utterly still, but there was another photo. This one was different. It didn't show her or the woman. Instead, it was a picture of the living room, her living room, taken from an angle high above the ground, as though someone had been standing on the ceiling. Jessica recognized the couch, the coffee table, even the lamp she'd knocked over last week and hadn't bothered to fix. But something was wrong. The room was filled with shadows, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. The shapes were inhuman. Long, spindly limbs that curled and coiled like smoke, clawed hands reaching out toward nothing. At the center of it all, seated on the couch, was the woman. She was staring directly at the camera, her lips stretched into a hideous grin. Jessica dropped the photo and stumbled backward, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her mind screamed at her to leave the house, to run as far and as fast as she could. But her legs felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by some unseen force. The camera clicked again. This time, Jessica didn't wait to see the photo. She bolted from the kitchen, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. As she reached the stairs, she glanced back, just once, and nearly collapsed in terror. The camera was no longer on the floor. It was perched on the countertop, its lens aimed directly at her, as if it were alive. Jessica didn't sleep that night. She locked herself in the bedroom, shoving a dresser against the door, and sat on the floor clutching her phone like a lifeline. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't call for help. Every time she dialed Kyle's number, the call failed. And then, sometime around 3 a.m., the scratching started. It came from the walls at first, faint and rhythmic, like nails raking across wood. Then it moved to the ceiling, heavier now, like footsteps dragging across the beams. Jessica covered her ears, rocking back and forth, but the sound only grew louder, more insistent. And then it stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed down on her like a weight, making it hard to breathe. She stayed there for hours, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. Finally, when the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she mustered the courage to move the dresser and open the door. The camera was waiting for her, sitting at the top of the stairs, its lens tilted upward like it was watching her. And there was another photo. Jessica thought throwing the camera away would solve everything. It seemed like the only logical answer. The thing was cursed, there was no other explanation, and getting it out of her house felt like her last chance to regain some semblance of peace. She waited until Kyle was out for the evening, unwilling to involve him further. He'd already dismissed her growing paranoia, brushing off her fears as a combination of bad dreams and an overactive imagination. But Jessica knew better. The photographs didn't lie. Under the dim light of the kitchen, she shoved the camera into a trash bag with shaking hands. The black plastic crinkled loudly in the otherwise silent room, each sound making her flinch. She didn't even bother to empty the trash bag properly. Instead, she drove to the nearest dumpster behind an abandoned gas station at the edge of town. The night was cold and suffocating, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin and makes you feel utterly alone. Jessica parked her car, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the overflowing dumpster. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave the camera behind without opening the bag. But some stubborn part of her, the part still clinging to logic, wanted to look at it one last time. She opened the bag slowly, half expecting the camera to leap out at her like a living thing. But it didn't. It just sat there, silent and unassuming, its cracked lens glinting in the light. For a moment, Jessica hesitated. She almost felt guilty, as if the camera were a stray animal she was abandoning to fend for itself. But the feeling passed as quickly as it had come, replaced by a deep, gnawing dread. She threw the bag into the dumpster, slamming the lid shut with finality. Driving back home, Jessica tried to convince herself it was over. She even felt a flicker of relief, a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in days. But that relief was short-lived. The moment she stepped inside her house, she knew something was wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was a strange smell, something faintly metallic like rust or blood. Jessica turned on the lights, her heart racing as she scanned the living room. Everything looked normal, but the feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. She checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even the closets, but found nothing out of place. Yet, she couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just out of sight. By the time Kyle came home, Jessica was pacing the living room, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. "You okay?" he asked, dropping his keys on the counter. "Yeah," she lied, avoiding his gaze. "Just tired." She didn't tell him about the camera, or the dumpster, or the fact that she could still feel its presence, even though it was miles away. It was better this way, she told herself. Safer. But that night, Jessica woke up to a sound that made her blood run cold. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the heater. A soft rhythmic clicking, like the sound of a camera shutter. She sat up in bed, her breath caught in her throat, straining to hear it again. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound came again, louder this time. Click, click. Jessica turned to Kyle, shaking his shoulder. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Kyle groaned, half asleep. "Hear what?" "The clicking. It sounds like..." Before she could finish, the noise stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and Jessica's chest felt tight, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. She reached for her phone, using the flashlight to scan the bedroom. Nothing. But when she turned back toward the bed, her heart nearly stopped. There was a photograph on her pillow. Jessica froze, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The edges of the photo were still damp, as if it had just developed, and the image itself was chillingly clear. It showed her and Kyle lying in bed, their faces pale and lifeless. Above them, a shadowy figure loomed, its skeletal arms stretched out as if about to snatch them away. She screamed, and Kyle bolted upright, disoriented. "What the hell, Jess?" Jessica shoved the photo at him, her hands trembling violently. "Look at this! Tell me I'm not crazy!" Kyle stared at the photo, his expression shifting from confusion to fear. "Where did you get this?" "It was on my pillow," Jessica said, her voice cracking. "I didn't put it there. I swear." Kyle rubbed his face, his jaw tightening. "This is insane. Are you sure you're not—" "I'm not imagining this," Jessica snapped. "Something is happening, Kyle. Something wrong." Kyle didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't believe her. Jessica spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, clutching a blanket like it could shield her from whatever was coming. Kyle stayed upstairs, his frustration evident in the way he slammed the bedroom door. Jessica couldn't blame him. If their roles were reversed, she might not believe it either. But her fear was justified. The next morning, Jessica found the camera on the kitchen counter. She stared at it, her mind reeling. She had thrown it away. She had watched the dumpster lid close, yet there it was, pristine and polished, as if it had never left her house. Jessica grabbed it, her pulse pounding in her ears. She opened the back, hoping to rip out the film, but there was none. The compartment was empty. Her confusion turned to horror as the camera whirred to life, its shutter clicking twice in rapid succession. 2 photographs slid out. The first was of Jessica standing in the kitchen, her face twisted in a mix of fear and anger. But it was the second photo that made her drop the camera. It was Kyle lying in bed, his face obscured by a dark, shadowy hand that seemed to be pulling him into the mattress. Jessica bolted upstairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She flung the bedroom door open, screaming Kyle's name, but he was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled as if he had been dragged out of it. Jessica's gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of him, but there was nothing. The only clue was another photograph, sitting neatly on the nightstand. It showed Jessica, alone in the house, her face frozen in a silent scream. And behind her, reflected in every mirror, was the woman. She wasn't in the photographs anymore. She was here. The noises started that same night. Jessica was alone now. She didn't know where Kyle had gone, or what had taken him. After hours of frantic searching, checking every corner of the house, every closet, even under the bed, she'd come up empty. The only evidence of his existence was that photograph, the one left on the nightstand, where the dark hand had consumed his face. It had to be the camera. It had to be. But the damned thing didn't follow the rules of reality. She had thrown it away. It came back. She tried to destroy it, smashing it against the concrete floor in the garage, stomping on it until her boots cracked the lens and splintered the frame. She'd even lit it on fire in the backyard, its black surface bubbling and hissing under the flames. But no matter what she did, it always returned. And now it was sitting on the coffee table again, whole and unscathed, staring at her like a silent predator. Jessica didn't touch it this time. She refused. Instead, she locked herself in the bedroom. She shoved the dresser in front of the door, just like she had done the night before, her hands shaking as she piled more and more objects against the entrance. She didn't trust the locks anymore. The house itself felt alive, like it was breathing with her, waiting for her to close her eyes. The walls seemed to creak with purpose, as if something inside them was moving, shifting closer. And then the scratching began. At first it was faint, almost like the sound of a mouse scurrying behind the drywall. But it grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. Long, deliberate strokes, like claws dragging against the wooden beams. Jessica's breath hitched as she pressed herself against the far corner of the room, clutching a heavy lamp as if it could offer some kind of protection. It wasn't just coming from one spot. The scratching was everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath her. The room vibrated with the sound, a horrifying symphony of nails on wood, relentless and consuming. She wanted to scream, to call for help. But who would come? Who would believe her? Kyle was gone. Her friends thought she was spiraling. And the police? They'd laugh in her face if she tried to explain that her boyfriend had been swallowed by a cursed camera. The scratching stopped suddenly, plunging the room into a silence so absolute that it was almost deafening. Jessica stayed frozen in her corner, her pulse roaring in her ears. She stared at the walls, waiting for the next sound, her hands clutching the lamp so tightly her knuckles turned white. And then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the other side of the door. It wasn't frantic or erratic like the scratching had been. This sound was deliberate, methodical, like someone was tapping their fingernails against the wood in a slow, calculated rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was soft at first, but it grew louder with each repetition, echoing through the room until it felt like the door itself was trembling under the pressure. Jessica couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The tapping continued, relentless and maddening. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the doorknob began to turn. Jessica's heart felt like it might explode. She hadn't heard footsteps. She hadn't heard anything that suggested someone, or something, was on the other side of the door. But now the knob was twisting slowly at first, then violently, as though someone was trying to break it off entirely. The dresser she'd shoved against the door groaned under the strain, the wood scraping loudly against the floor. And then came the whispering. It wasn't a single voice. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping and intertwining, creating an incoherent murmur that seeped through the cracks in the door like smoke. The words were unintelligible, but their intent was clear. Hungry, malicious, desperate. The voices sounded as though they were coming from all directions, surrounding her, suffocating her. Jessica screamed, clamping her hands over her ears, but the whispering only grew louder. It crawled inside her head, gnawing at her sanity like worms burrowing into her brain. She stumbled backward, tripping over the bed frame and landing hard on the floor. Her vision blurred with tears as she stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. And then it stopped. Jessica stayed on the floor, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The silence was worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, like it was watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. Slowly, shakily, she got to her feet. She crept toward the door, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. Her hand hovered over the dresser, ready to push it aside, but she hesitated. Something moved behind her. It was a flicker of motion, so quick and subtle that she almost didn't catch it. But when she turned around, the air in the room felt different, colder, heavier. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The camera was on the bed. Jessica's stomach dropped. She had left it in the living room. She was certain of it. But now it was here, perched on the rumpled sheets, its lens pointed directly at her. And it was clicking. Photographs began to slide out, one after another, falling onto the floor in a messy pile. Jessica didn't want to look, but her body betrayed her. She bent down, her trembling hands picking up the top photo. It was of her. She was standing in the bedroom, just as she was now, her face pale and streaked with tears. But in the photograph, she wasn't alone. The woman was behind her, her hollow eyes staring directly into the camera. Her mouth was open, her jaw unhinged, and her hands were reaching for Jessica's shoulders. Jessica dropped the photo with a strangled sob, but the camera continued to whir, spitting out more and more images. Each one was worse than the last. Pictures of her screaming, pictures of her running, pictures of her cowering in the corner. And in every single one, the woman was closer. The final photograph made Jessica's blood run cold. It showed her lying on the floor, her body twisted and broken, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The woman was crouched over her, grinning, her jagged teeth inches from Jessica's throat. And then the camera stopped. Jessica looked up, her entire body shaking. The woman was standing in the corner of the room, her form blurry and fragmented, like a glitch in reality. Her head tilted to one side, her empty eyes locked on Jessica. The last thing Jessica heard was the sound of the shutter clicking. When the police arrived the next morning, the house was silent. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though every sound had been vacuumed out of the air, leaving only a hollow, oppressive void. Officer Bradley, a veteran with over 15 years on the force, was the first to step inside. He couldn't explain it, but from the moment he crossed the threshold, a chill crept up his spine, settling deep in his chest. Something about this place felt wrong. Not just eerie, but fundamentally wrong, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Jessica had been reported missing. Kyle's co-workers had called it in after he failed to show up for work for 2 days in a row. Neighbors hadn't seen either of them in days, and their cars were still in the driveway. The house wasn't locked when the officers entered, but it didn't feel abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood. Yet as Bradley moved through the living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. "Something doesn't feel right," muttered Officer Davis, his younger partner. He had stopped in the hallway, staring at the family photos that lined the walls. Bradley followed his gaze. The photos were ordinary at first glance. Holiday snapshots, smiling faces, a couple on vacation. But as Bradley looked closer, unease coiled in his gut. The smiles in the photos weren't right. They were stretched too wide, their eyes too sharp, too predatory. It wasn't something you noticed immediately, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. In one picture, Kyle's face was turned slightly away, his features blurred as if he had moved during the shot. But the shadow behind him hadn't moved at all. It stood still, tall and thin, with arms that seemed unnaturally long. Bradley shook his head, pulling himself back to the present. "Let's clear the house," he said, his voice sharper than intended. Davis nodded, but the younger officer's hand hovered near his holstered weapon. The house felt endless. Every room they entered seemed darker than the last, the shadows pressing against the walls like living things. The deeper they went, the colder it became. By the time they reached the master bedroom, Bradley could see his breath fogging in the air. The bedroom was empty, the bed unmade, as if someone had left in a hurry. The only thing out of place was a stack of photographs neatly arranged on the nightstand. Bradley's pulse quickened as he approached them, an inexplicable dread rising in his chest. The first photo showed Jessica sitting on the couch in the living room. She was smiling, but her eyes were wide, terrified, like someone being forced to pose at gunpoint. The next picture was worse. It was the same angle, the same setting, but now there was someone behind her. A woman, tall and gaunt, with stringy black hair that clung to her pale face. Her eyes were hollow voids, and her mouth was twisted into a grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. "Jesus Christ," Davis whispered, leaning over Bradley's shoulder. "What the hell is this?" Bradley didn't respond. He flipped to the next photo, then the next, his hands trembling. Each picture was more horrifying than the last. In one, Jessica was screaming, her hands raised as if trying to shield herself. In another, she was lying on the floor, her body contorted in ways that defied anatomy. The final photo wasn't of Jessica at all. It was Kyle. Kyle's body hung suspended in mid-air, his limbs limp, his face obscured by the same pale, skeletal hands that had appeared in the earlier photos. The shadowy figure loomed over him, its mouth open as if it were devouring him whole. And then, at the bottom of the stack, was a single Polaroid of the two officers. Bradley felt the blood drain from his face. The photo was of him and Davis standing in the very room they were in now, staring down at the photographs. But the details were wrong. In the picture, Bradley's face was twisted in horror. And Davis wasn't standing anymore. He was lying on the floor behind Bradley, his mouth open in a silent scream. "What the—" Davis began, but the words were cut short by a loud crash from downstairs. Both men jumped, their hands flying to their weapons. "Stay here," Bradley barked, but Davis was already moving toward the door. The crash had come from the living room. The officers moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was heavier now, suffocating, and the smell of burnt plastic lingered faintly in the air. When they reached the living room, the sight that greeted them made Bradley's stomach lurch. The camera was there, sitting on the coffee table. It hadn't been there when they first entered. Bradley was certain of it. The camera clicked. Both men froze, their flashlights trained on the Polaroid as it whirred softly, spitting out a new photo. It landed face down on the table, its edges still damp. Neither man moved to pick it up. "Let's get the hell out of here," Davis said, his voice shaking. But as they turned to leave, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing longer and darker, stretching toward the men like tendrils. Bradley's flashlight flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment, the beam illuminated the figure standing in the corner of the room. It was the woman. Her form was fragmented, glitching in and out of focus like a corrupted video. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her hollow eyes fixed on the two officers. She took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were learning how to use a human body. Davis fired his weapon. The gunshot shattered the silence, echoing through the house. But the woman didn't flinch. The bullet passed through her, lodging in the wall behind her, and then she smiled. The lights went out. Bradley's world descended into chaos. The whispering returned, louder and more frenzied than before, a cacophony of voices screaming in languages he didn't understand. Something cold and wet brushed against his arm, and he turned, only to find Davis lying on the floor, his eyes wide and unseeing. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, and his body began to sink into the floor, as if the shadows were swallowing him whole. "Davis!" Bradley shouted, grabbing for his partner, but his hands passed through him as if he were made of smoke. The camera clicked again. Bradley spun around, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The woman was inches from his face now, her breath cold against his skin. Her grin widened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Bradley tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The last thing he saw was the flash of the camera. When reinforcements arrived later that day, the house was empty. No sign of Jessica, no sign of Kyle, no sign of the officers who had entered before. The only thing left behind was a single photograph lying on the coffee table. It showed the living room, dark and empty. But in the center of the frame, the camera sat upright, its lens pointed directly at the viewer. And reflected in the lens was a woman's face, smiling. Do you hear it? That faint sound behind you? Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe it's something watching you, waiting to be seen. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. But tell me, if you found an old camera, would you dare take a picture?